Jordan Peterson of Voltage. Welcome to
Yes, yes.
AV123. You're a writer and a producer of high-energy audio podcasts. And now you say on the landing page of your website that in a rapidly expanding universe of free audio content, your work is worth paying for. So do tell us why you say that, dear sir.
I hope it's relatively self-explanatory. Just that, we do live in an age with a glut of content. There's so much that you could listen to, and most of it's free. And we really like to specialize in the stuff that takes a little more care. It's a little less about, feeding the content mill and more about trying to take some time and think about what's going to be really high quality and what is going to really give people a valuable experience. Something that's really joyful or educational or a mix of both. And that's the aim. So whether or not we're always successful, who knows? But that's the goal of the company. That's kind of why we formed up.
Why has the concept of free audio become such an expectation?
It's a great question. I mean, I feel silly here because all I'm going to be doing is sort of badly riffing off of people who have spent a lot of time studying and unpacking this question and have done a much better job communicating it to the public than I ever will. But here it goes. Just the fact that the internet started out pretty early on with a model of advertising revenue running a lot of stuff. So we've just been acculturated to consuming online media in general, I think for free based on ads. And I think when audio came along, you were looking at an ecosystem, especially when podcasts were really new. Well, there were two things, right? There was radio, which has always been free and always been ad driven. And then there was music, which has become more and more quote unquote free because of, again, ads, lots of streaming platforms that started off making all of their revenue with advertising. And then Spotify coming along and, finding a way to charge you one very small price for everything. And then even offering, free versions of their library with ad support. And then podcasting came along, and it was when it was new and for a long time. And I would say even still, still feels like it's a pretty impoverished ecosystem in terms of how much money there is in it. And so in order to try to, make things, you're trying to find a way to do things as cheaply as possible. And, the best thing you can do is you can get a reasonably sized audience and how, but people like the expectations are already set. They're not going to pay for it. And so I think it's very, very, very challenging to convince people to pay for audio content. It's challenging to get people to pay for any kind of content anymore. And there are exceptions, and there are some listeners, some audience, some demographics who will be a little bit more willing or a little bit more interested in paying for some media here and there. But I do think that the default baseline is free.
So
Or
if I come to you as a client and I say to you, why should I pay you? What are you going to tell me?
Why should you pay us as in the producer?
Yes.
It's a great question. I mean, we've recently become more aware that we are not in the sort of commodity services business, meaning if all you're doing is, hitting record on an interview like this one, and then you're throwing some intro and outro music on it, like you should not be coming to us to pay us. If you want a lot more attention and kind of intelligent care in terms of how to structure your show, your episodes, if it needs a higher level of editing to make sure, like, for instance, let's say you do have an interview show, but you want your episodes to be under 40 minutes, but you record interviews that are an hour and a half long, and you really need some help to figure out how to structure that and how to get it down to be a much more streamlined package. And maybe there are some other segments and elements you'd like to include. It needs a little bit of attention and some kind of bespoke mixing. Like that would be the kind of interview show that we do. And then beyond that, I would say things that are a little bit more narrative nonfiction or even audio fiction is stuff that we really, really love making because, yeah, this is something you can't just turn on a mic, right? And you can't just throw it into script and put some intros and outros on it and call it good. So yeah, I'd say you should pay us if you need more help than what you can do yourself with the abundance of tools that are available to, people who are doing it kind of casually.
Would you be able to simply define high energy audio?
Well, I think that was mainly just a play on the name of our brand, because since we're Voltage, we'd say we're high energy. We're very, very nimble. So we move very quickly. We move as fast as our clients want us to or can move themselves. And we are able to do that because we have very minimal overhead. We have a very, very small core team, and then we have a lot of producers and contractors in our sort of orbit who we can bring in to scale up and down as necessary. And so we can move very, very quickly and at relatively low cost, considering what we do and what we're capable
Yeah.
of compared to other production agencies that offer similar services, but I would say for probably higher price points. So yeah, high energy is kind of just like a shorthand way of trying to capture
Now,
that vibe.
the impression I get, Jordan, is that you guys at Voltage favor audio as opposed to
We do.
video.
I have to be careful here. So my opinions are my own. um,
No, fair enough. Let me qualify that by contextualizing it. That I agree with you in the sense that I think audio is far more powerful than video, and I'll tell you why I say that. Interestingly, it was Jennifer Moss of Jar Audio, as a production agency, who said to me something that struck me, that there's a pact, an audio pact that a presenter sort of makes with a listener. And that pact is actually important because there's an intimacy involved where the communication becomes more authentic. Would you agree with that?
100%. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think in order to really answer your question or to answer even just this topic or this idea, it would be I would have to kind of go back and just give a very short history of how I even got into podcasting
Yes,
because
please do.
I started off I studied film for 6 years, undergrad and then graduate school all the way through an MFA in screenwriting. And then I worked on a docu-reality series for a small TV network for a couple of years. And then I got into video marketing, and then I got into video game esports production, which was a very interesting environment. Worked with wonderful, amazing people, but ultimately decided to leave that job in that industry because I felt myself getting drawn farther and farther into what I felt like was a race to the bottom of the attention economy. And I, in the meantime, had been listening to a lot of podcasts and I had started my own podcast with a friend. And I just really loved the medium because it seemed like, I could see the best way that I could highlight the contrast. And I would have said this even at the time is that on the one hand, you can watch, TikTok videos at like 30 seconds a pop, or you can, and remember nothing, or you can listen to a 4.5 hour interview between two people that you really respect on some podcast, right? And the fact that I, had that I was so invested in that kind of content, and not that every episode of a podcast you listen to is that long, but just this idea of like these long form, intimate, as you said, conversations, it really felt like the podcasting, and not that all podcasts were doing this, because I certainly think some podcasts are still sort of, engaged in that race to the bottom of the attention economy, but it was certainly a medium where there was more of an effort to go the other direction, to completely sort of upend the expectation of what the relationship between a consumer and of content would be. And so I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to work in an industry that was not sort of making the culture worse. And I felt like there was a real opportunity to try to deploy my, I think, pretty well-honed production skills and writing skills in a medium that felt frankly more virtuous, and that there was more opportunity for deep searching, honest, truth seeking and thought and connection than in a lot of other media. And I still love movies and I still love TV and I love YouTube, frankly. I think it's
Mm.
great. I won't touch TikTok. But I think that podcasting is still this beautiful medium that has a lot to offer. And, I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but when it comes to video podcasts, there's something else going on there. And I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I'll shut up for a second so you can so you can respond.
My follow-up question would be this. Why do you think video pod is held in such high regard then?
It seems pretty easy to me. And I think a lot of people who should know would agree with me. And I've talked to a couple of them. So, and I won't quote anyone here at the risk of being wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's because all of the roads have been built for a video. And the infrastructure's all there for sharing and advertising, and just the content ecosystem for video is robust and mature way beyond what it is for audio. And we have, frankly, we have YouTube to thank for that
Yes.
primarily, and more particularly, we have Google, who we all should have
Yeah.
some mixed feelings about, but we have Google to thank for the insane foresight they had, 20 years ago in buying YouTube at a loss and then plunging like billions of dollars into a company that was never going to be profitable for many, many years, knowing that if they could corner the market on video, they would dominate, like they would continue to dominate search and a lot of the sort of new content ecosystems. So what happened was they invested an insane amount of money at a loss for a long time in building the ecosystem and infrastructure of video. And so when you get to podcasts, now trying to grow, trying to compete with, content consumption, trying to figure out how to do analytics, trying to figure out how to do sharing and marketing and all this and promotion, all this stuff. Well, if you have a video podcast, suddenly all that stuff becomes like all of the robust ecosystem and infrastructure of video becomes available to you. If you don't have a video podcast, none of those tools are available to you, or very few of those tools are available. And we are still in the process, I think, of watching people try, and people are making a lot of progress in trying to build out those tools for the audio only podcasts, but it's still so far behind video that it's very, very, very challenging for audio podcasts to keep up just in plain marketing terms with video content. So I don't think it has hardly anything to do with the virtue of the medium itself. I don't think it has hardly anything to do with whether or not a podcast is better or worse as a video podcast. I think it comes all the way down to it is an economical question. How do you actually grow your show? And if you have a video podcast, you just have all those advantages. And if you don't, you don't.
From the perspective of engagement dynamics, I think it would be fair to say that audio-only podcasts, as we touched on with Jen Moss of Jar Audio, that they foster a more intimate connection with listeners compared to video podcasts. And it would be equally fair to say that that is actually quite crucial for audience retention. How would you approach that in terms of selling your product to a client?
Well, that's a great question. Full disclosure, Voltage has only been around for about a year and a half. So we are not the sort of OGs in this space. I think that if you're talking to Jen Moss from Jar Audio, like she's going to have a lot more intelligent things to say about all of this than I will. So I give that as a very big disclaimer. But when we talk to clients about whether or not they should do video or whatever, I have landed, especially, well, it kind of also comes down to what format you're talking about, right? So there's a lot of podcasts that you just can't do with video. Like you're not going to be able to just easily convert complicated narrative nonfiction podcast into a video podcast. It's not going to happen. Yeah. But most interview-based podcasts, which I think the majority of podcasts are, and many of the most profitable podcasts are interview podcasts or talk shows of some kind, there's a world in which you can kind of like do a relatively simple conversion from audio to video. So I think that there's a pretty good compromise in taking podcasts that were recorded, that you have the recorded video assets, releasing them and publishing them as audio only podcasts, but then using the video assets you have to create promotional content. Because at the end of the day, you want to get as many of the advantages of the video ecosystem as you can without losing your advantages of the audio ecosystem. And I do think that the relationship between the audience and the podcast is better or more intimate, or I just think that shows can be better when they're audio only. Most of them can. And so I think that, you can, if you want to, package your podcast and put it on YouTube, great. It's a different audience. You will find different audiences on YouTube than you find in just RSS feeds outside of YouTube or outside of the video system. But yeah, I don't think it's super necessary. I think at the end of the day, most shows that are simple interview shows can do just fine if they can find ways to leverage the video infrastructure without making a quote unquote video podcast. And there are a number of ways of doing that, but I think the promotional assets are a big part of that. And we do a lot of that work, and we're starting to specialize in that kind of work with promos and teasers and trailers and so forth, and clips, just like pulling clips from shows and putting them on social accounts and figuring out ways to reach wider audiences with the content of your show. And I think that those are all really, really valid and important ways to grow audiences. But when it comes to the actual experience of the show, like the full experience of an episode of the show, I think that audio is the most important. It's the most important medium, and it's the most important format for the show is to be in audio. So yeah, that's again, that's kind of my opinion. We are very capable of doing video podcasts. We wouldn't, I don't think, be able to stay in business if we couldn't do video podcasts. Yeah. But that's kind of how I feel about it. But again, I have to recognize the you have to sort of contend with the primacy of video.
A social media marketing friend of mine said to me that the trouble with audio only is you can't really use clips as promos or adverts on social media. Is that a fair statement?
Well, it's a fair statement if you don't have video along with the clip.
Yes,
Uh,
in other words, audio
yeah,
only.
yeah, it is a fair statement. And I've had similar conversations with people. I have a show that I started a few months ago as an experiment to see if I could do a daily podcast. And it's a newsletter that lives on Substack. And I also publish it as a podcast. And each episode is like 3 minutes. They're very, very, very short. And I wanted to kind of experiment with, you know, creating some promotional assets for it and clipping from it, et cetera, and different platforms. And I talked to a couple of people who are much better at that stuff than I am, and they told me, they're like, if you don't record yourself, if you don't have like your video, then these things will not perform. They will not perform on TikTok or Instagram or YouTube or wherever. And I believe that, because you are, again, you're competing with something that, if someone is scrolling, if someone is like staring at their screen and you don't have a face with the words, you're going to really have a really, really hard time capturing attention. So I don't think this is a very much sort of left field comment, but I don't think that audio or podcast will get over that hurdle or that problem until there are social platforms or content platforms that are as robust and as shareable and as sort of, networked as, let's say, TikTok or Instagram or whatever, but audio only. So
Yeah,
literally things that people would consume, and to create an expectation. And, lots of people have tried to make platforms like this and they haven't worked yet. So I
yeah.
don't even know if it is possible. I do think it is possible, though. I think it's mostly a UI problem. But considering how many people have earphones or earbuds like in their ears constantly, I think that there's got to be a way for someone at some point in the next 10 or 20 years to crack open the audio first, audio only social sharing, like UGC kind of content platform that would make the kinds of sort of sharing that we're talking about, the kinds of, audio only promotional assets that we're talking about, actually effective. And I don't think we're there yet. Maybe I don't, but I have no idea what it would take to get there. But I think that would need to happen before that stuff becomes really effective and we see the full sort of potential of what audio could be.
As an aside question, quickly, why do you think podcasting has become such a thing?
Well, I mean, one answer is that I'm not the only one who felt the way I felt, right?
Yeah,
That that I think that there was a growing cultural hunger for longer form media, for deeper, more meaningful conversations, for, really intellectually, even spiritually searching questions and explorations of topics and ideas that we just were not getting anywhere else. And so I think, I mean, there's a reason, like Joe Rogan, the reason that it became so big is because he was one of the first people to do this thing where he just would talk to someone for a couple of hours and then post the entire thing. And so, he figured out, or I don't even know if he did it consciously. I think he just wanted to do it. And it turned out that like lots and lots and lots of people really loved that thing. To be able to listen to a couple of people just talk about something that mattered to them for a long period of time was something that no one else was doing. And so I think that's the primary reason that podcasting became as sort of successful as it did, and that the reason the industry is growing in the way it is. And there's lots of other formats, but I think that almost all of the other formats, I think in some way or another, compete with other kinds of media. Like if you listen to narrative nonfiction, for instance, like a docu-series or a true crime, whatever, you're sort of competing with, the Netflix docu-series, right, about true crime, right? You know, where else are you going to find just like really long, raw conversations? Nowhere. Like nobody's doing that other than podcasting.
it's very interesting that a friend of mine, I'm going to throw this at you, a friend of mine over a beer one evening smiled when I talked about audio podcasts, and he said to me that in terms of the video audio debate, your more intelligent people will go for audio only because it usually has to do with deep, meaningful, authentic subjects as opposed to video. How do you feel about that statement? You think so?
Boy, I feel really uncomfortable agreeing with that. But because it feels very sort of self-aggrandizing. But I kind of feel the same way when I was talking to a friend of mine who doesn't have a smartphone and has never gotten a smartphone, and he's been using a dumb phone for his entire adult life. And he says, "Oh, I've been thinking about getting a smartphone," and I'm like, "Don't do it.
Yeah.
Like it's not worth it. Like if you've survived this long, just don't do it. Don't do it." And he said, it's funny. All of my smarter friends have told me that I shouldn't do it. I'm like, well, okay, I'll join that camp. So I do feel the same way, and I think it's because the medium is the message, right? Like,
Yes.
and when you're watching YouTube, and I watch a lot of YouTube. I love YouTube. I think it's great, but I don't go to YouTube really for that kind of content, and
Yeah.
I think that's an important distinction. So it's a context thing. So if you're going to watch video, if you're going to scroll through video, if you're looking for distractions from something, then you probably aren't looking for deep searching questions and explorations of interesting ideas and topics. What you're probably doing is looking for some dopamine. and
Yeah.
like and so I think that doesn't necessarily to me signal a marker of unintelligence. It's just again a context issue. So yeah, if what do you want? Where are you going to go to get what you want? What
Yeah.
kind of media are you going to consume to do the job that you're looking to get done? And so maybe you could make some judgments about, the kind of person that only is interested in dopamine chasing on YouTube versus the person that doesn't do that at all and only listens to super intelligent podcasts. But I do think that most people are a little bit of both. And so, yeah, but I do think the observation is still very pretty astute.
Let's have a look at, in terms of the debate, let's have a look at the question of cost efficiency. How large a role does that play in the video audio debate? Because video is surely, if you want to make a great video, is surely far more expensive than just audio only.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I think that the line starts to get really blurry between a video podcast and what is essentially just a show. And so, because, YouTube channels and vlogs and YouTube essay and, video essayists, et cetera, have been around for a long time and they predate podcasts and they've been going along just fine without podcasts. So if you're making a podcast that is a video podcast, but it's also this highly produced video, then is it a podcast anymore? I don't know. Like
Mm.
I would hesitate to at that point, even call it a podcast. And so, yeah, there's a huge cost differential between making a what looks to be a highly produced and professional looking YouTube or video in general versus a highly produced, polished, professional piece of audio content. You can do a very good, very beautiful, very professional sounding piece.
You can create pictures with audio, and as opposed to dictating to your viewer what they are looking at, you force them to use their imaginations and create their own imagery. And that was the greatest advantage I felt about audio. The other thing, of course, is listener accessibility. The benefits of audio-only podcasts, particularly for multitasking audiences, if you like, or even those with visual impairments. I mean, video is no good for them. So is that not a way of promoting the concept of audio over video?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that it's interesting that you see if you look at the analytics of the audiences that are consuming one kind of content versus another, that when you create a video podcast, for instance, that exists as audio only, but then also has a video version that you can watch on YouTube, what you're going to find is that you find just different audiences on one versus the other. It's not like you've got, a big portion of your RSS audience that just like says, "Oh, you're on YouTube now. Let's go watch your video." Like they're not
Mm,
going to go over. They don't care. But then there's a bunch of audience members maybe who wouldn't have never discovered your podcast unless you were on YouTube, and so they're going to go over. They're only going to watch it on YouTube. But we've also seen audio only. People are clicking over it onto their tabs. They're walking away. They're whatever. They're mostly just listening because they don't need to watch because it's not necessary to watch. And so if it's not necessary to watch, then people won't watch. They'll just listen. So I do think that there's a huge advantage in making something that is audio first at the very least, so that you don't have to watch, because it does like sort of free people up to go do other things. I mean, I do most of my listening on my morning jog, when I'm doing chores, when I'm doing the dishes at night, when I'm making my kids like breakfast and
mm,
lunch in the
mm.
morning. I do most of my listening then because I'm doing a lot with my hands, but my mind is free, and I would love to be listening to something. And so I listen to podcasts or audiobooks or whatever. And yeah, I think that this is the killer advantage of audio only, is that, or audio first at least, is that you can get to people in way more places. It's interesting too because people's attention, the way that attention works cognitively, is that we are more likely to pay closer attention when we're doing a mindless task. If we're just occupied enough with, like, let's say folding laundry, that we will listen in more closely, we will retain more, we will care more, we will have a closer relationship with what we're listening to than if we are, you know, kind of zoning out in front of a screen. And so, yeah, I think that it's there's so much to love about audio, and it's in many ways it's our first medium of communication. I mean, if you think about, like, pre-modernity, what did you have before you had mass media? You had newspapers, you had radio, sure, but even before radio, what you had was people talking. And if you were going to be talking to someone, if you're just going to be communicating with someone, often you're not even looking at them. You're just talking and they're talking and you're listening to each other. And every once in a while you might check in, you look over, whatever. But how much of human history has been dominated by conversations that happened while people were at work, while people were taking care of their families, while people were busy doing things but talking to each other. And I think this is the thing, in our atomized, isolated world of modernity, where everyone is kind of like in their little silo of content and concerns or whatever. Podcasting is sort of returning to us at least a portion of, I think, what we may have by and large not completely lost, but what we have so much less of, in that sort of like that, very deeply human sort of original, fundamental, foundational form of communication of just listening and hearing. And for those of us who podcast, of speaking. So yeah, I think it's really lovely. I think it's almost sacred insofar as, the depths of our human nature are.
I simply cannot say anything after that statement. Jordan Peterson of Voltage, thank you so much for being on AV123. It's been a pleasure having you.
Likewise, thanks so much for having me.